Futurism. Dispensational Futurism. Where did it come from? The modern futurist pastors will tell you that it has its origins in the early church, although there is really no evidence for that. And trying to make their writings into teachings about futurism requires a vast imagination. I'm going to read to you from Clarence Larkin's book, Dispensational Truth. Now, if you don't know who Clarence Larkin is, he was a Baptist preacher and the author of a book titled Dispensational Truth. Larkin is considered the grandfather of 20th century dispensationalism. Every futurist pastor in America has heard of Clarence Larkin, and if they haven't, they ought to be ashamed of themselves, because this is where their ideas come from. Clarence Larkin is a little bit off track on certain things, but he's bang on others. We're going to explore that on page 16 of his book. I think this is really important because, again, I've been listening to futurist pastors on YouTube, and most of them are really very ignorant of Larkin's book. Let's turn to an authority on dispensationalism. Clarence Larkin, page 16, Dispensational Truth. He writes, "The futurist school interprets the language of the apocalypse literally, accepts such symbols as are named as such, and holds that the whole book from the end of the 3rd chapter is yet future and unfulfilled, and that the greater part of the book from the beginning of chapter 6 to the end of chapter 19 describes what shall come to pass during the last week of Daniel's 70th weeks." Let's stop for a minute. That is an accurate representation of futurism so far. It is in fact what the average futurist pastor teaches. Let's continue. This view, while it dates in modern times only from the close of the 16th century, is really the most ancient of the three. Let's stop again. When he says ancient of the three, he's referencing preterism, historicism, and dispensationalism. Continuing. It was held in many of its prominent features by the primitive fathers of the church, and is one of the early interpretations of scripture truth that sunk into oblivion with the growth of the papacy, and that has been restored to the church in these last times. Now let's stop there. If you take the time to read the writings of the primitive fathers of the church, you will find it very difficult to get futurism out of their writings. You have to have a vivid imagination. And the reason for that is every one of them taught that the Antichrist would emerge when the Roman Empire crumbled, dispersed into 10 kingdoms, and the little horn rose up in the midst. Now that happened. The Roman Empire crumbled, and what replaced it, amidst 10 kingdoms, was the papacy. That happened during the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries. We have the historic record. Rome crumbled, was broken into these 10 kingdoms, and then up came the little horn, the papacy. So for Clarence Larkin to say that these primitive fathers of the church taught the futurism he's talking about is totally misguided. They did not. The futurism of Clarence Larkin requires Antichrist, or the little horn, to emerge sometime about 7 years before Christ returns. They're very different. So the church fathers did not teach what Clarence Larkin says. Now he also says here, and is one of the early interpretations of scripture truth that sunk into oblivion with the growth of the papacy. Now that is not true, nor is it logical, because the papacy would have no reason to hinder or seek to suppress futurism because it serves their purpose. It protects the papacy. So Larkin's inference That the growth of the papacy somehow overshadowed these teachings makes no logical sense at all. In fact, to the contrary, it would have been more logical for the papacy to promote those teachings. And the reason for that is the early church fathers were not teaching futurism, and therefore there was nothing to sink into oblivion. Larkin says, and that has been restored to the church in these last times, referring to his so-called restoration of futurism. Now, it is true that futurism has been brought into the church in these last times, but it is not accurate to say it has been restored, because it never was. Let's continue. He writes, in its present form, it may be said to have originated at the end of the 16th century with the Jesuit Ribera, who, actuated by the same motive as the Jesuit Alcazar, sought to rid the papacy of the stigma of being called the Antichrist. Now that is absolutely true. It in fact had its origins in the 16th century with the Jesuits, and the very reason that Larkin gives is in fact the truth. It was the job of Ribera, Alcazar, Bellarmine, and others to get rid of that stigma. The papacy did not want to be known as the Antichrist. So let's continue with Larkin's writing. To rid the papacy of the stigma of being called the Antichrist, and so referred the prophecies of the apocalypse to the distant future. So you see clearly, this is where futurism came from. So when you hear your backwoods pastors talking about futurism, promoting this end-time Antichrist, and playing their little game of pin the tail on Antichrist, so you know that even the grandfather of 20th century dispensationalism taught that very thing. It was for the purpose of ridding the papacy of the stigma of Antichrist. He writes, this view was accepted by the Roman Catholic Church and was for a long time confined to it. But strange to say, it has wonderfully revived since the beginning of the 19th century, and that among Protestants. It is the most largely accepted of the three views. And so he goes on to say some other things. Let me give you a quick recap. Clarence Larkin claims it was taught by the primitive fathers of the church. It was suppressed by the papacy, then revived by the papacy. But he makes no mistake in identifying that it originated at the end of the 16th century with the Jesuits. That part is true. The rest of what he says about the early church teaching it and it being perhaps suppressed through the growth of the papacy doesn't make any sense at all. It's a doctrine that serves the papacy. And the papacy is very logical. There is no reason it would have suppressed something that served their purpose at that time. Not a chance. So Larkin is spinning things a bit when he says the early church fathers taught this. And he knows that most people aren't going to go and read those very arcane and troublesome documents. And most don't. They just believe what the pastor says off the front of the church. They don't take the time to sort through these things. And so he's counting on that. But he is honest in saying that what we see of dispensationalism today comes from the Jesuits. And there's no mistake about that. When you hear pastors deny that futurism was a Jesuit conspiracy, I've heard one pastor preach at length on that subject, denying the very facts of the fathers of dispensationalism, and in particular, Clarence Larkin. Let no man deceive you. Let God be true, and every man a liar. Go read these old documents, reason through them, think through them. Use the logical part of your brain. Draw the connections. It doesn't make sense. The papacy suppressed futurism in the early church? Not a chance. Not a chance. They would have no reason to do that and every reason to promote it. And that's exactly what happened. You see, when you get to the 16th century, guess who's promoting preterism and futurism? The papacy. One through the Roman Catholic doctrines, one through the Jesuit teachings. They serve the same purpose, creates this great hole in church history when there's no Antichrist, when there's nothing prophetic. The papal system loves futurism and preterism. They hate historicism. So stop and think logically about these things. What is the reason for this conflict? And what is the reason for the dynamic between preterism, historicism, and futurism? If preterism serves the Vatican, and futurism serves the Vatican, and historicism does not, you decide what makes sense. You decide what is true. Thank you for listening.